In Red Bluff, they sold people like cattle. She was called Lot 27, broken, nameless, and left for the vultures. But when one rancher laid down a silver dollar, he wasn't buying property. He was defying a world without mercy. And what began that day would change them both forever. The wind carried more than dust across the sun-baked town of Red Bluff. It carried sorrow, heavy and lingering, like the smell of gunpowder after a duel. Every wooden boardwalk creaked beneath the weight of men who'd long since forgotten what mercy looked like. At the center of town, the auction block stood crooked and sun-stained, not from rain or time, but from the shame of what it was used for. It wasn't livestock being sold. It was people. And today, it was a girl. She stood with her hands bound and her head bowed. Her cheeks were sunburnt and her lips cracked. A dress that once might have been white clung to her in soiled rags, torn at the hem blood on the sleeve. She said no name, there was none left for her to offer. The townspeople had already replaced it with something easier, Lot 27. But then, as the auctioneer's voice barked numbers like commands into the dry air, a single sentence emerged, barely more than a breath. Please, just don't drag it out. It wasn't defiance. It was exhaustion. It was the last thread of a soul stretched too thin, and yet it silenced the square. Even those who came to mock fell quiet, because something in that whisper sounded too human to ignore. In the back, leaning against a weathered hitching post, stood Colt Bennett. He hadn't come to bid. He hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks. Folks whispered he was half wild, a rancher with too much land and not enough heart left to fill it. His wife had died 5 years ago, a fever the doctor wouldn't treat without payment. Since then, Colt had spoken more to horses than to men. But something in that girl's voice, a stranger's plea, broken but clear, reached through the barbed wire around his chest. The auctioneer tried again. Do I hear $10? 5, even 1. Someone in the crowd scoffed. A laugh broke out. One man spat and offered a coin like a joke. But Colt stepped forward, calm, deliberate. He didn't say a word. He just held out a single silver dollar, polished and silent in the sun. The crowd stilled. The auctioneer blinked, then shrugged. Sold. They didn't cut her ropes gently. She stumbled off the platform, catching herself on bare feet too bruised to protest. She didn't cry. She didn't thank him. She didn't look up. But Colt did something no one expected. He took off his coat, coarse, lined with dust and wear, and draped it over her shoulders like she mattered. Not as a prize, not as a rescue, but as a human being who had been cold for far too long. He didn't take her hand. He didn't lead her with reins. He simply walked ahead slow enough for her to follow, but never looking back to see if she would. Back at the ranch, he made a place for her at the table and ladled out bean stew. She stared at the bowl like it might be poisoned, then glanced toward the knife block across the room. He noticed, but said nothing. Trust wasn't something he expected. It was something he would wait for if it ever came. She finally spoke after the third bite. Name's Sadie. Colt nodded. Bennett. Colt. No one smiled. But something shifted, small as breath, real as thunder. What began in silence did not end with rescue, nor romance, nor anything Red Bluff would understand. It began instead with a refusal to look away, a decision to see one broken soul, not as debt, not as shame, but as someone worthy of beginning again. And as the wind moved over the dry hills that evening, stirring dust and memory, it carried something new for the first time in years. Not sorrow, but hope. The journey from Red Bluff to Colt Bennett's ranch was marked by long shadows and longer silences. The sun was beginning its slow descent, dragging the sky into hues of rust and violet. Sadie Quinn walked 3 paces behind him, not because he ordered it. He hadn't said a word since the auction, but because she didn't yet know if she wanted to follow him at all. She could have run, slipped into the hills, vanished into the brush like a ghost. But her feet hurt too badly, and her ribs still ached where a boot had landed days before. Besides, she had nowhere to run to. Colt didn't look back, didn't ask her name. He walked like a man used to silence, and Sadie moved like someone who'd been trained to disappear into it. When they arrived at the ranch, dusk had settled. The barn creaked under the weight of wind, and the lantern Colt lit inside the kitchen glowed a faint amber, like a firefly lost in a bottle. He motioned toward the chair at the corner table, then went to the hearth and stirred a pot already half full. He didn't offer a smile or even a greeting, just ladled out some kind of stew into two mismatched tin bowls and slid one across the table toward her. Sadie stared at it. She'd been fed before, but always by men who wanted something back. So she waited, watched, measured him the way a wounded animal measures the steps of an approaching hand. Colt sat opposite her, his own bowl untouched. He looked older up close, not by years, but by wear. His knuckles were rough nails stained with soil, his shirt collar frayed. His jaw moved slightly as if grinding thoughts he hadn't yet spoken. "You can eat," he said after a while, his voice low and even. It didn't sound like permission. It sounded like a statement of fact. Sadie picked up the spoon, careful not to clatter it. Her hands trembled with hunger, but her eyes remained alert. She looked toward the door once, then toward the window, then toward the knives hanging near the stove. Colt noticed. He didn't react. Trust wasn't something she gave. It was something that had been carved out of her. She took a bite. The stew was salty, full of beans and overcooked carrots. It was the best thing she'd tasted in months. Halfway through, she paused, cleared her throat still raw from days without water. "Sadie," she said. Colt blinked like he'd just remembered she could talk. "Colt." She nodded once and returned to eating. That was the end of it for the night. Later, Colt showed her the spare room. It wasn't much, just a cot, a worn blanket, a cracked basin near the window, but there was a lock on the inside of the door. He didn't mention it, just gestured. She stepped inside and he closed the door gently behind her. She stood in the dark, clutching his coat still draped around her shoulders. It smelled of wood smoke and horses. She didn't cry, didn't dare. She just sat on the edge of the bed watching the moonlight crawl across the floorboards like a silent visitor. Every creak of the old house made her flinch. Every gust of wind outside sent her shoulders curling forward as if waiting for a blow. She didn't sleep, not really, and neither did Colt. He lay on the couch in the other room, one hand behind his head, staring at the ceiling as if it held answers he hadn't yet earned. He didn't know what he was doing. He'd gone into town for nails and feed, not this, not her. But when he heard her voice back at the auction, low, resigned, defeated, he felt something tear loose inside him. Not pity, recognition. Because 5 years ago, he'd heard his wife make a sound like that, just before she died after waiting 3 days for a doctor who never came. He hadn't saved her, and it had hollowed him out from the inside. In the days that followed, they moved like two animals circling a fire, not close enough to warm each other, not far enough to be alone. Sadie woke early and waited for instruction. Colt never gave orders. He simply handed her tools, pointed to a task, mended a fence beside her without words. She noticed things. How he didn't watch her the way other men did. How he gave her space. How he always made 2 plates even when she didn't show signs of hunger. He even left the kitchen once so she could eat alone. On the 3rd morning, he found her sitting on the porch step wiping dust from a pair of old boots she hadn't touched since arriving. "You don't have to work," he said from the doorway. She didn't look up. "I know," but she wanted to. That evening, after helping him load hay, she asked, "You always lived this quiet?" He looked at the sky before answering. "Only since I stopped talking to people who didn't listen." Sadie nodded. She knew that kind of quiet. By the end of the week, she no longer flinched when he entered the room. She still slept with one hand under the pillow, still kept her back to the wall. But when Colt poured her water, she met his eyes. Briefly, and for her that was something. Late one afternoon, while they watched a distant thunderstorm rolling in, she asked the question that had gnawed at her since that first night. "Why'd you do it?" she said. "Why me?" He didn't move. "Because someone should have done it sooner." "That's not an answer." "No," he said quietly. "It's not." She waited. "My wife," he finally said. "She died because I couldn't afford to keep her alive. And no one stepped in. Not even the ones who could have." Sadie was silent for a long while. Then softly, "Me neither." "What do you mean no one stepped in?" "Not when I was hungry. Not when they sold me." She looked toward the hills. "I think I stopped expecting them to." Colt didn't respond, but she saw his hands flex at his sides, subtle, restrained, like something inside him was breaking and rebuilding at once. That night, when she went to bed, she closed the door gently behind her, but didn't lock it. Not because she trusted him completely, but because for the first time, fear didn't feel like the only option. There was no moment when it changed. No dramatic sunrise or speech that turned fear into trust. It was the way things happened between them, slow, steady, like rain softening dry earth. Mistrust didn't vanish overnight. It simply had fewer places to hide. Sadie Quinn rose early each morning before the rooster crowed, not because she was told to, but because rest still felt like a luxury she hadn't earned. The guest room Colt had given her remained sparsely used. She often sat by the window long before dawn, wrapping herself in his old coat like a shield against dreams that hadn't faded. She watched the sky warm, watched shadows stretch long across the corral, listened to the horses shift in their stalls. Colt didn't force her into anything. He offered tools, not orders. A shovel leaned near the barn door, a milk pail by the coop, a saddle draped across a rail. He'd gesture once. If she picked it up, she did. If not, he never said a word. And that, oddly enough, was how it started, with a bucket of grain and a hen that refused to be handled. Sadie stood in the chicken yard one morning trying to scatter feed when one of the old red hens pecked her ankle. She jumped, startled, nearly spilling the entire pail. From the barn, Colt chuckled once, dry, distant. She turned toward him, startled. "You laughing at me?" she asked. "Little bit." She narrowed her eyes. "I've seen men hanged for less." He tipped his hat back. "Then I'll die with a smile." She didn't laugh, but her lips twitched. Just a little, and that was enough. From then on, they moved in rhythm. She learned how to guide horses by tone rather than tug. He showed her how to mend a bit of broken harness using rawhide and patience. When the sky grew heavy with storm clouds, he taught her to listen for the low warning rumble in the wind, the shift in bird song that meant lightning wasn't far behind. They rarely talked about themselves. Not directly, but conversations still happened. "What happened to your hand?" she asked once, seeing the old scar that bisected his knuckle. "Wire fence." "Colt." I had back then got spooked, tore loose. He's still around, numb. Shot himself trying to jump a creek too wide. You get a new one. He looked at her then. "Don't replace everything that breaks." She didn't ask more, but her eyes lingered. One afternoon she brought in firewood without being asked. Set it beside the hearth. He noticed, said nothing. But the next day there was a new pair of boots by the back door. Sturdy, worn, but sized for her. She hesitated before slipping them on. You could have asked. You could have refused. Still doesn't mean I'm staying. Still doesn't mean I'm pushing. There was no fight in his words, no expectation, just space. It made her uncomfortable at first, this man who didn't want anything, who didn't leer, who didn't hover. He didn't pry into her past, didn't ask about the men she'd been sold to before, didn't demand gratitude like a toll. Instead, he gave her quiet. And in that quiet, Sadie began to rediscover herself. She started humming while brushing the horses. She asked him one evening if he'd ever thought about painting the porch rail, then did it herself with an old can of whitewash she found in the shed. She picked wildflowers and placed them in a chipped mug on the table, though she never admitted it was her. Bit by bit, the space between them softened. Then came the night of the storm. A lightning bolt split the sky and knocked out the lantern in the barn while Colt was still inside. Sadie, hearing the horses scream, ran out barefoot through the rain. She found him pinned under a loose timber, soaked to the bone, trying to free himself without panicking the animals. She didn't hesitate. She heaved the beam just enough for him to slide free. Together they calmed the horses, secured the roof with extra nails, and hauled fresh hay to dry bedding. They didn't talk about it afterward. But that night, he left the door between their rooms cracked open just enough for the lamplight to spill through. And she didn't close it. A week later, they sat on the porch in silence, sipping coffee as dawn crept over the hills. Sadie turned to him and asked what had sat on her chest since the day he handed over that silver dollar. "Why me?" He didn't answer right away, just scratched his beard as if the question hurt more than he expected. "I was in town for salt blocks and seed," he finally said. "Heard the auctioneer yelling. I wasn't planning on stepping in." "But you did." He looked at her then, not at her face, but into it. "Because I've seen what happens when nobody does." Sadie took a deep breath. "Well, I didn't need saving. I know. But you gave me space, and tools, and silence. That I didn't expect. You deserve to be more than what others carved you into." She blinked, unsure what to say. She had been carved into silence, into property, into something men could own or pass along. But here, in this odd, quiet life with this stubborn man, she was becoming someone again. Not all at once, but enough to matter. There was still distance between them. Still fear that flared in the back of her mind at loud sounds, sudden movement, or nights too quiet to trust. But Colt never asked her to be someone else. He simply stayed near fixing fence posts, roasting coffee, leaning on the porch rail like time had nowhere else to go. And for a woman like Sadie Quinn, that was the beginning of everything. The heat that day came down like judgment, dry, unrelenting, and thick with something more than summer. It was the kind of heat that made men short-tempered and made horses twitch at the flies. Sadie Quinn stood barefoot on the porch of Colt Bennett's ranch house, a pitcher of water in one hand, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Something had changed in the air. Not the sky, not the birds, something else. A kind of stillness that didn't belong. She felt it before she saw it. A thin line of dust coiling behind 3 riders as they crested the ridge and began their slow approach. Her fingers clenched around the pitcher. She set it down carefully on the railing so it wouldn't shatter when her hands began to shake. Then she turned, stepped back into the house, and found Colt at the stove, flipping cornbread in a cast-iron pan. "They're coming," she said. That was all she had to say. Colt's hand stilled mid-motion. He turned off the flame, set the pan aside, and walked past her without asking who. He already knew. By the time the riders reached the front gate, Colt was standing on the packed dirt with his arms crossed, hat low over his brow, boots planted firm. Sadie remained just inside the doorway, out of sight, but close enough to hear every word. Her heart thundered in her chest, but she held her ground. Leading the group was Sheriff Wade Lancer, riding a chestnut gelding and wearing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. His vest was too clean for a man of law, and the badge on his chest gleamed like something polished for intimidation, not justice. "Well now," Lancer drawled, reining in just a few feet from Colt. "Ain't this a pretty little setup you got here?" Colt said nothing. Lancer gestured toward the house with his chin. "Heard you took in a girl. Sadie Quinn goes by. She's not exactly free to go wandering off." Colt shifted his weight. "She's not wandering. She's living." Lancer chuckled, but it was a dry, cold sound. "That girl was part of a debt, Bennett, legally auctioned. I oversaw it myself. Which means you harboring her, well, that looks a whole lot like theft. She's not property. She was bought. She was thrown away." Lancer's grin dropped. The two other men behind him shifted in their saddles, hands near their holsters but not yet drawn. Colt stepped forward slowly, voice low and even. "You're not taking her," Wade Lancer spat into the dust. "And you think you can stop me? I'm not stopping you. I'm telling you it ends here. You got no authority. I got enough backbone to make you earn whatever you try." There was a long pause. No sound but the creak of leather and the restless snort of a horse. Inside the house, Sadie pressed a palm to the doorframe to steady herself. Her knees were weak, but her spirit was standing taller than it had in years. Lancer dismounted slowly, his boots sinking a little into the dust. He walked up until he was a few feet from Colt, his hand near his belt. "You really willing to throw away your name, your land, your neck, for a girl who ain't even yours?" "She is now," Colt said quietly. "Not because I paid for her, but because I gave her back what you took. Her name, her will, her future." Lancer's lip curled. "That ain't how it works." Then maybe it's time it did. The silence that followed felt like thunder pressed flat. The kind of stillness that comes just before a storm, when everything holds its breath. Sadie stepped out from behind the door. Her bare feet touched the porch like roots taking hold. Her dress fluttered in the warm wind. She looked small beside Colt, but her eyes were the strongest thing on the ranch that day. "You don't own me," she said, voice calm but loud enough to reach all three men. "You never did." Lancer turned to her. "You think he can protect you forever?" "No," she said, "but I can protect myself now. And he's not the one hiding behind a badge polished by fear." The words stunned them all, even Colt. Lancer's face twisted into something mean and quiet. He stepped back and climbed onto his horse without another word. The two men behind him followed suit. Before he turned, Lancer muttered, "This ain't finished." Colt didn't blink. "Then I'll be right here when it is." And with that, the sheriff and his riders disappeared down the trail, swallowed by dust and distance. Afterward, Colt stood silent for a long moment, watching until there was nothing left but empty road. His shoulders rose and fell once as he exhaled a breath he hadn't known he was holding. He turned to Sadie. "You all right?" She nodded. Her hands still trembled, but her eyes were steady. "You didn't have to do that. I did." Why, Colt looked out across the pasture where sunlight shimmered off tall grass. "Because you don't just fix broken things with tools. You fix them by not letting them get broken again." Sadie stared at him, eyes brimming with something too full to name. Gratitude, maybe, or belief, or the first thread of love that had nothing to do with rescue. She reached out just barely and touched his arm. Not to hold, not to cling, but simply to anchor herself to the moment. That night the wind shifted. A coolness crept through the valley, lifting dust and memory alike. Sadie sat by the fire while Colt mended a boot sole. Neither spoke much. They didn't need to. The line had been drawn that day, not in blood, not in bullets, but in something much harder to undo. Conviction. Colt had faced down the law, not for glory, not for vengeance, but to give her back the thing most men stole without guilt choice. And Sadie, for the first time in her life, had chosen to stay. Not out of survival, but out of trust. The days that followed the standoff settled differently on the ranch. The wind no longer carried unease. The silence no longer hummed with waiting. Something unspoken had shifted not just between Sadie Quinn and Colt Bennett, but in the very soil beneath their feet. It was as if the land itself had exhaled. Colt returned to his chores like always, but there was a new ease to his movements. He whistled while tending the horses, though the notes were off-key and hesitant like a man remembering a song he hadn't dared hum in years. Sadie noticed. She didn't mention it, just smiled when he wasn't looking. For her part, Sadie began to move differently too. Not skittish or invisible as she had once been, but deliberate. Present. She touched things without fear. Curtains, saddles, her own hair. She asked Colt about where to plant vegetables come spring, what to do if a calf was born breech, how to boil lye soap without scalding the skin. He answered each question with the same quiet steadiness. No pride, no lectures, just the kind of patient instruction born of a man who never expected to teach again, but found joy in doing so when it was asked, not demanded. One crisp morning, a little before sunup, Sadie stood on the porch cradling a tin cup of hot coffee. She watched mist roll over the field and breathed in the smell of soil and ash and something else she couldn't name, something good. Behind her, inside the table, was already set for two. She had sliced bread from the day before, fried up some leftover potatoes, even attempted to scramble the eggs just like Colt liked them, still soft in the middle. He emerged from the barn with straw in his hair and paused when he saw the table. "You trying to poison me?" he asked. She raised an eyebrow. "Not today." He chuckled, washed up and took his seat. As they ate, he noticed a small sprig of wild sage in a cup on the windowsill. He didn't mention it, but he looked at it long. It wasn't long after that the first knock came. Not a knock on the door, but a sound from the fence line. A faint voice calling out. Sadie was kneading dough in the kitchen when she heard it. She stepped onto the porch and squinted toward the gate. There, just beyond the wooden rail, stood a girl. No older than 16, barefoot and bruised. Her lip was split, one eye swollen. Behind her a woman, maybe her mother, clutched the hand of a toddler, their clothes torn and dust-streaked, their expressions carved from desperation. They said nothing. They didn't have to. Sadie stepped off the porch. Her boots hit the earth like they belonged to her. She walked to the gate, unlatched it slowly, and opened it wide. "You're safe now," she said, voice steady. The girl's chin trembled. "We have water, food." You don't have to explain anything. Still no words, only the quiet fall of footsteps as they entered. From the barn, Colt watched the whole thing unfold. He didn't interfere. He didn't offer approval. He simply stood back, hat in hand, and let Sadie lead. Later, he found her laying out spare blankets in the loft and heating broth over the fire. The little boys sat curled against the hearth, already fast asleep. The woman hadn't stopped crying since she arrived, and Sadie, without judgment, had simply let her. "You all right?" Colt asked, his voice soft, so as not to wake the child. Sadie nodded, tucking the blankets closer to the wall. They didn't have to say it. I knew. I recognized the way she held his hand, like it was the last thing she owned. Colt didn't speak, just looked at her, really looked, and saw not the girl from the auction block, but a woman becoming. "You built this," he said after a moment. She blinked. "No, you did. I built a fence and a barn. But you made it mean something." Sadie stood quietly, her fingers still brushing wool. "I just gave what was given." Word spread in ways that didn't require mail or shouting. It drifted through whispers in town, carried in looks passed between women, fetching water, tucked into the silence after a slammed door in a house where kindness didn't live. And one by one they came. A woman with a black eye and 2 hungry sons. A half-Comanche girl with rope burns on her wrists. A runaway in a bloodied nightgown who never spoke a word. Sadie opened the gate for each one. No questions. No names if they didn't offer them. Just warm broth, clean blankets, a basin to wash in. Safety. She kept a notebook tucked inside the kitchen drawer. In it, she wrote down their initials and the dates they arrived, not to keep records, but to remember they had existed as more than pain. Datu. One night, Colt found her sitting on the porch steps long after everyone else had gone to bed. The stars hung low. The crickets were loud. A soft wind rustled the dry grass in the pasture. He sat beside her, handing her a cup of coffee. She took it, then whispered, "Do you ever wonder what it would have been like if someone had opened a gate for your wife?" Colt swallowed. Every day. Sadie's eyes stayed on the sky. Then maybe this is her doing. Through you. Through me. He didn't reply, but he placed a hand gently over hers, resting between them like something unspoken and sacred. The ranch no longer felt like his, and that strangely felt right. It wasn't a place of livestock and isolation anymore. It was a quiet beacon, a crooked latched door left open to those who'd never been allowed to knock, a patch of land stitched back together by hands that had once been broken, and Sadie Quinn girl, once sold for $1, was now the keeper of its fire. Not because she was saved, but because she had learned how to save. The ranch was no longer just a stretch of land fenced in by timber. And time it had become a kind of living testament to something most folks in Red Bluff had long stopped believing in: change. Not the kind that came fast and loud, but the slow, deliberate kind, built one act of grace at a time. Where once Colt Bennett had lived in silence and Sadie Quinn in shadows, now the porch creaked under quiet conversation, and the warmth of barefoot children chasing chickens through dust-soft morning light. Sadie no longer flinched when someone knocked at the door. She opened it with calm hands, shoulders square, heart steady. And more often than not, there was someone on the other side who reminded her of who she used to be: a woman carrying bruises beneath her sleeves, a boy who refused to speak, a mother who hadn't been touched gently in years. They came like fragments, jagged and afraid, and Sadie, with patience carved from fire, helped them fit together again. The land changed too. What had once been a working ranch became something closer to a sanctuary. They still raised horses and harvested hay, but now there were garden rows between the pastures, beds of herbs near the kitchen door, and wind chimes made from rusted spoons tinkling beneath the eaves. Women stitched together scraps of cloth, not just for warmth, but for memory, each quilt square telling a story no one else had ever bothered to write down. Colt never claimed to understand it all. He still woke before dawn, still checked every latch and hinge, like a man who trusted nothing fully, not even peace. But when he watched Sadie lift a child into her arms without hesitation, or saw her lead another frightened soul through the gate, she once crossed barefoot and bleeding, something loosened inside him. Guilt had ruled him for years. Now it simply sat beside him, like an old friend acknowledged, but no longer driving the reins. One evening they sat on the porch, beneath a sky brushed with starlight. The lantern flickered low. Sadie leaned her head against Colt's shoulder, the rhythm of her breathing steady as the crickets humming in the grass. "You know," she said, her voice softer now than it used to be, but not from fear, from peace. "I used to pray someone would end it quick." Colt didn't look at her, just nodded slow. "I remember. But you didn't," she continued. "You made it slow, and safe, and real." He smiled faintly. "The best things usually are." And in that moment, they understood without needing to say it, healing wasn't a single choice or one act of rescue. It was the daily decision to stay, to witness someone without trying to fix them, to let the broken mend at their own pace. The ranch wasn't just Colt's anymore. It was Sadie's too, and every soul who passed through its gate left something behind, grief maybe, but sometimes laughter, often silence, always the start of something new. They hadn't set out to build a legacy, but somehow, without knowing, they had. A legacy not of names etched in stone, but of doors left open, meals cooked without questions, and firelight shared with those who needed warmth the most. A legacy that whispered even in the coldest wind, "You are not forgotten. You are not alone. You can begin again." If this story moved, you don't forget to subscribe to Whispers of the West, where every tale is a tribute to quiet strength, redemption, and the healing power of human connection. Join us for more cinematic Western stories that linger in the soul long after the dust settles. Like, share, and help us keep the fire burning.